Continuing Dreadnought, Book 4 in the HIVE series by Mark Walden. High above the artificial storm cell, a giant hatch opened in the tail of the cloaked aircraft that had been shadowing the Dreadnought for nearly an hour. Jason Drake watched as the men that Furan had recruited for him filed toward the opening, each wearing a full bodysuit, helmet, and a large, solid-looking black backpack. "Any sign that they've seen us?" Drake asked. He asked one of the men sitting inside the cramped control room at the front of the plane. "No, sir," the man responded. "Radar is still in passive acquisition mode and weapon systems are in standby configuration. If they have seen us, they are doing an excellent job of pretending they haven't. Looks like our cloaking systems are functioning perfectly." "Give the assault team the go," Drake ordered, and turned back to the view screen. He hit a switch, and the view changed to a schematic diagram of the Dreadnought, with several points on the external superstructure clearly highlighted. It had not been difficult to work out the best method for attacking the huge vessel. After all, he had had a hand in designing many of its critical systems. Drake knew that this was the point of no return. He was taking the final irrevocable step across the line that would mean an outright declaration of war. That was why he intended to strike at Dark Doom directly. The only way to slay such a vicious beast was to lop off its head, and Drake was a firm believer in decisive action. He couldn't help but wonder how things might have turned out differently. When he had first conceived the Dreadnought, it had been his dream to present it to Number One as a gift that would secure him a place at his former master's right hand. But then Nero and Dark Doom had struck against Number One and carried out their treacherous coup. He had listened patiently as they had spun their ridiculous story about the Overlord AI secretly being in control of Number One, and had recognized it immediately as the cover story for the blatant power grab that it was. Drake had watched in silent fury as Dark Doom had taken over the organization almost completely unopposed by the ruling council. They could not see how unsuitable he was, how he lacked the ruthlessness and cunning that had made Number One their leader for so long and with such success. It had been even more galling when Dark Doom had learned of the Dreadnought project and declared that he would take control of the vessel and use it as his own personal flagship. Drake had no choice but to allow Dark Doom to take the ship. He had not been in a position at that point to openly defy him and the council, but that was all about to change. He had new backers now. A new organization that was even more powerful than Glove, and one that was going to restore the correct balance of power to the world, and nothing, not even Dark Doom, was going to stop them. The Disciples' time had come, and the world would be changed forever. "Assault team away," a voice reported. "I've got something strange here, sir," one of the Dreadnought's bridge crew reported to Dark Doom. "What is it?" he asked, walking over to the man's station, with Nero close behind. "A large number of radar contacts directly above us, but they're tiny," the man replied. "It couldn't be a flock of birds, not at this altitude," Dark Doom said, as he studied the curious radar signature on the display. "Some kind of weapon system?" "It doesn't match any existing profile," the crew member replied, "but at their current rate of descent, they will reach our altitude in 45 seconds. Dark Doom frowned. "Give me visual," he ordered, running toward a large display on the wall of the bridge. The screen lit up, relaying an image from one of the powerful high-definition cameras that were mounted on the Dreadnought's superstructure. At first, it was almost impossible to see anything against the dark storm clouds, but then the camera zoomed in, and Dark Doom could just make out a swarm of tiny black shapes. "Whatever they are, I don't like the look of them. Activate defensive weapon systems," Dark Doom ordered. "Yes, sir," another man responded from a nearby console. "All defensive systems online. Trying to lock on to targets." "Report!" Dark Doom snapped after a few seconds had passed. "Anti-missile batteries are online," the man replied. "Targets in range in 3, 2... Dark Doom watched in horror as suddenly each of the black blobs seemed to sprout a pair of wings and jet away in numerous different directions. Through the hole he could hear the distinctive buzzing sound of the heavy machine guns that formed their last line of anti-missile defense starting to open fire. 1,000 feet above the Dreadnought, the mercenary felt the air bladders in the G-suit he was wearing inflating, forcing the blood to his brain and ensuring that he would not pass out during any of the high-G maneuvers that the flight pack strapped to his back was performing. He had no control over his own spiraling flight path. The systems in the pack were automatically steering him toward his designated target point on the Dreadnought, while making sure that he was an almost impossible target for the huge vessel's defense systems to hit. He had to admit that he had felt a twinge of fear as they had plummeted in free fall toward it, but the flight pack had performed exactly as it had done during training. They had been preparing for this mission for weeks, and at first it had taken some getting used to that sickening wrench as the winglets deployed and the jets fired, sending him spearing off on his own unique designated flight path. But he had to admit that he had grown to like the adrenaline rush. The flight pack banked hard to the left and dived, just as the air a few seconds away was torn apart by bright white flashes of tracer machine gun fire. The mercenary breathed a sigh of relief. Furion had been honest with them. Only about 90% of them would make it to the Dreadnought, and that had been too close for comfort. ETA on target. 10 seconds, a soft synthetic voice said in his ear as the hull of the Dreadnought filled the view through his helmet visor. The jets fired again, and he felt himself start to slow as he passed over the guard on the gantry running along the upper deck of the superstructure, and landed gently on his feet just a couple of yards from a hatch that led inside. The winglets retracted, and he quickly removed the bulky unit from his back. He hit a switch on the side of the smooth black pack, and the cover retracted, revealing an assault rifle and an equipment harness filled with spare ammunition clips and grenades. Behind him, another 2 of Furion's men landed on the gantry and began to remove their packs as he moved to the doorway and held a small silver box up to the locking mechanism. There was a short pause, and then the door slid open with a hiss. The first mercenary looked over his shoulder and checked that his 2 companions were armed and ready. Seeing that they were, he went inside. Team 6, infiltration complete, proceeding with assault, the mercenary said, into his microphone that was inside his helmet. Roger that, Team 6, a calm voice replied in his ear. Proceed on target. All targets beside primaries are expendable. Repeat, expendable. Understood, the mercenary replied, raising his assault rifle and moving inside. What's going on? Otto asked Raven as she followed him up the ramp into the shroud. They could hear the sound of the Dreadnought's guns firing, but they had no idea what they were firing at. Wait here, Raven said to Otto and the others, as she went back down the ramp and ran across the bay to where one of the ground crew was speaking frantically into his handheld communicator. She spoke briefly to the man before hurrying back. Stay on board the shroud. Lock the hatch and don't let anyone in but me, understood? Raven said. What's happening? Shelby asked quickly. Something's wrong, isn't it? We're under attack, Raven said matter-of-factly, pulling 2 long scabbards from among the equipment stowed on board. I'm going after Nero and Dark Doom. Hostile forces on multiple decks, one of the Dreadnought's bridge crew reported. Where are the security teams? Nero asked Dark Doom. There are none, he replied, looking angry. They were due to come aboard tomorrow once the final technical checks were complete. We've been running with a skeleton crew to minimize the risks if anything should go wrong, and I can only assume that whoever is responsible for this knew that. We need to get you out of here, Nero said calmly. We're outnumbered and outgunned. No, you have to go. Whoever has launched this attack cannot possibly know that you're here. Get my son out of here, Max. I will stay and fight. Nero looked like he might argue for a moment, but then he thought about his students who were now caught unexpectedly in the middle of this. Very well, Nero said, but rest assured I will find whoever is responsible for this. He placed a hand on Dark Doom's shoulder. Of course you will, Dark Doom replied with a grim smile, and I pity them when you do. With a nod, Nero turned and hurried off the bridge. Dark Doom headed over to the security station, watching as the invading forces moved unmolested through the halls of his own ship. Incoming transmission, sir, one of Dark Doom's crew reported. It's using a glove transmission protocol. On screen, Dark Doom replied quickly. The screen lit up, displaying the smiling face of Jason Drake. Drake, I should have known that I couldn't rely on you to crawl under a rock and die quietly somewhere, Dark Doom said angrily. A pleasure to see you too, Diabolus, Drake replied calmly. I believe it's time to discuss the terms of your surrender. Now why would I do that? Dark Doom snapped. Because I already have over a dozen strike teams on board your vessel whose standing orders are to execute anyone they encounter. The only way for you to prevent the bloodbath that is about to ensue is to surrender now. I'm only going to make this offer once. You will be captured or killed either way. It makes little difference to me. Why, Drake? What makes you want to destroy everything we've spent so long building? Glove was founded on the basis that individually we were weak, but united we are strong. United? Drake spat angrily. Once we were united, but now things have changed. Glove is no longer the organization it once was. People no longer fear us as they once did, and that which people do not fear, they do not respect. Number 1 understood the importance of fear, the importance of rule through strength, and since we lost that leadership, we have lost our way. I will not sit idly by and watch as you lead this organization down a road of compromise and weakness. I'm going to remind the world what it is to feel fear again, and through that fear, we will remain strong. You sound like number 1, Dark Doom said coldly. And we put him down like the rabid dog that he was. I swear that one day I'll do the same to you. Enough, Drake snapped. What is it to be? Surrender or massacre? The choice is yours. Dark Doom stared back at Drake. He could see it in his eyes that he was not bluffing. There was nothing to be gained by further resistance. It would just cost the lives of his crew. Power down the defense grid, Dark Doom said quietly. All crew members are to surrender immediately. Nero ducked into a corner behind a piece of heavy machinery as he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. A moment later, 3 men wearing black military equipment and carrying assault rifles rounded the corner ahead of him. They moved like professionals, sweeping the hallway slowly and carefully. It would only be a matter of seconds before they found him. Nero had always refused to carry a gun, much to Raven's displeasure, but even if he had been armed, he would have stood no chance against 3 men with rifles. He would rather surrender with dignity than be found hiding like a trapped rat. He stepped out from his hiding place, hands raised, and the 3 black-clad men all raised their rifles, pointing them in his direction. Stay where you are, the lead man barked. Down on your knees, hands on your head. The 3 men advanced as Nero dropped to his knees and put his hands on his head as instructed. The lead man lowered the muzzle of his rifle, pointing it at Nero, his finger tightening on the trigger. Just as he was about to fire, a voice in his helmet spoke. New standing orders from command. All units are to capture and restrain any opposing forces. Repeat, capture and restrain, the voice said. Looks like Mr. Drake doesn't want any more bodies, the lead mercenary said, looking down at Nero. Nero felt a surge of anger at the mention of Drake's name. He had suspected that he would be planning some sort of attack on Glove, but he hadn't been expecting it to come as quickly as this. The soldier gestured for Nero to stand up with an upward twitch of the rifle's muzzle. I guess this is your lucky day, the man said with a twisted smile. Happily, I can't say the same for you, Nero said with a grim smile as he got to his feet. The mercenary in the middle of the group of 3 grunted with surprise, looking down at his chest where the tip of a blade crackling with purple energy had just appeared. He toppled forward as Nero dived to one side. Raven stepped from behind the man and wrapped one arm around his throat while using her free hand to grab his rifle. As his finger jerked reflexively on the trigger, she pulled the rifle hard, bringing it to bear on the other man, who staggered backwards when several rounds hit him squarely in the chest. Finally, she twisted the other man's head to one side with a sickening crunch, and he fell lifelessly to the floor. She stepped forward and pulled her sword from the body of the first man to fall. Time to go, she said, offering Nero her hand. Where are the others? Nero asked quickly as he stood. Waiting on board the shroud, Raven replied. Where's Diabolus? On the bridge. He wouldn't come, Nero replied. I'll get him, Raven said, putting her katana back into one of the crossed scabbards on her back. No, Nero said quickly. We have to get the students out of here, especially Nigel. That mercenary just confirmed my suspicions. Jason Drake is the one behind this. Nero didn't want to think about what would happen if Drake got his hands on Dark Doom's son. Raven stared back down the hall leading to the bridge, a look of angry frustration on her face. After a couple of seconds, she let out a sigh and turned back toward Nero. You're right, Raven said quietly. I just don't like leaving Diabolus behind like this. He's saved both our lives in the past. And we will repay that favor, Nero said firmly, but not today. Raven gave a small nod and picked up one of the dead men's rifles. Without another word, the pair of them hurried away down the hallway, heading for the hangar bay. Well, that can't be good, Otto whispered, as their pilot was marched out of the control room by one of the soldiers who had been searching the area. The pilot had left the shroud to see if he could find a way to initiate the ship's refueling, but had only managed to get himself captured in the process. Now Otto and the others lay hidden among the piles of equipment at one end of the passenger compartment, watching through the open loading hatch as the remaining soldiers began to methodically search the other 2 shrouds docked in the hangar bay. "Anyone got any ideas?" Shelby said quietly. "Not really, unless you've got 7 thermopic camo suits hidden somewhere that you're not telling us about," Laura replied. "I am thinking that the Arctic is not seeming like such a bad option now," Franz said in a nervous whisper. Otto's mind raced as he watched the 2 men move across the hangar toward them. He had only one option. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes. Otto hadn't tried to connect directly to the digital world for months, but he knew that his ability to directly interface with the computer systems that surrounded them might be their only chance. The noises of the world around him seemed to fade away, and he had the uncanny sensation of detaching from his physical body. Suddenly, the data network that kept the Dreadnought functioning appeared around him, a crystalline lattice pulsing with neon bursts of light. He extended his senses and searched for the control systems of the shrouds in the hangar bay. They were protected by multiple layers of security and encryption, but Otto just brushed them aside as if they weren't there. He was surprised by the ease with which he'd been able to circumvent the protection. It was almost like someone else had done it for him. Suddenly he had an odd feeling that he was not alone, as if there was someone right behind him, and yet there was no one else there. He shook the sensation off and refocused on the task at hand. Finding the systems he wanted, he seized control and allowed some of his consciousness to return to his body. "Otto," Wing whispered, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "Are you okay?" "Fine," Otto said, feeling the familiar sense of slight disorientation as he reconnected with the physical world. "Keep your heads down." Otto pushed with his mind, and the engines on one of the other shrouds parked in the hangar bay whined into life. The 2 soldiers spun around toward the unexpected noise, raising their rifles as the shroud began to slowly lift off the deck. Both men opened fire, strafing the aircraft's cockpit with high-velocity rounds, puncturing the fuselage and cracking the reinforced glass of the windows. The shroud swiveled in midair, turning to face the startled mercenaries, and with a roar from the engines raced across the hangar straight toward them. One of the men dived out of the way, but the other was hit full on by the rounded nose of the dropship, flying through the air and landing with a heavy thud several yards away. The other soldier climbed to his feet, raising his rifle again. Otto sent the shroud spinning slowly on the spot, raising the nose and lowering the tail. The soldier had just enough time for one short burst of fire before the tail of the aircraft swung around, inches from the ground, and swatted him backward with a bone-crunching smack. "Get their guns," Otto said quickly as he mentally fought to control the spinning shroud and bring it back down to the deck safely. Wing and Shelby ran from their hiding places, sprinting down the shroud's loading ramp and toward the injured soldiers' fallen weapons. The first man was almost on his feet when Wing reached him and put him down with a swift kick to the side of his head. Shelby scooped up the second soldier's rifle moments before he could reach it and leveled it on the advancing man. "What are you going to do, little girl? Shoot me?" the mercenary sneered as he stepped toward her. Shelby lowered the muzzle of the rifle and shot the thug in the knee. He dropped to the ground, howling in pain. "Something like that, yeah," Shelby replied, keeping the rifle levered at the whimpering soldier. Wing popped the clip out of the other soldier's rifle, smoothly removed the firing pin, and threw it across the hangar, dropping the useless gun to the floor with a look of distaste. Otto shut down the engines on the shroud that he had been controlling, and followed Laura and the others over to where Shelby and Wing were standing. "Geez," Lucy said, looking down at the wounded man. "You guys weren't kidding about the whole trouble magnets thing, were you?" Wing stepped forward and placed one foot on the soldier's wounded knee. "I have no desire to inflict further pain on you," he said calmly, "but I will if you force me to. How many more of you are there?" "More than you could handle," the soldier spat angrily. "How many?" Wing repeated, pressing his foot down slightly. The man cried out in pain. Okay, at least 30, maybe more." "Thank you," Wing said, taking his foot off of the soldier's injured leg. "You've been most helpful." Wing reached down and pinched a point at the side of the man's neck, and his eyes rolled upward as he collapsed backwards, unconscious. "Okay," Otto said quickly. "We have to get out of here. It's safe to assume that it won't be long before they send another team to check on these guys, and I, for one, would not be here when they do." "Agreed," Laura said, "but that's easier said than done. Even if we can get the hangar door open, none of us can fly one of these things." "Which means we have to wait for Raven to get back here with Nero and my dad," Nigel said. There was the sound of gunfire from the other side of the hangar as Raven and Nero sprinted through the door. "To be speaking of the devils," Franz said nervously. "Where's my dad?" Nigel said half to himself. Raven stopped and raised the rifle she was carrying to her shoulder, firing a short burst through the door behind her. Nero ran to his students and grabbed the rifle from Shelby. "Get to the shroud, now!" Nero barked, turning to squeeze off a burst of cover fire as Raven sprinted across the hangar toward them. 3 soldiers ran through the doorway from where Nero and Raven had just come, and returned fire, rounds buzzing past Otto and the others like angry hornets as they boarded the shroud. Raven and Nero continued to return fire, and Raven pulled a small gray cylinder from her belt, lobbing it toward the soldiers coming from the doorway. There was a flash and a loud bang, and the area began to fill with thick white smoke. Raven and Nero took advantage of this temporary diversion, and were only a few yards from the ramp when there was another short burst of fire from somewhere behind them. Raven grunted, staggering forward as a bullet hit her in the thigh. Nero caught her before she could fall to the ground and helped her up the last few steps of the shroud's loading ramp. He smacked the large red button on the bulkhead to raise the ramp, and lowered Raven gently to the ground. He ran toward the front of the passenger compartment, ripped an emergency medical kit from its mount on the wall, and threw it to Wing. "Gauze pads, apply pressure to the wound," Nero said angrily, pointing at Raven. "Malpens with me." Nero climbed quickly up the ladder to the flight deck with Otto right behind him as Wing tore the medical kit open. Nero collapsed in the pilot's seat and punched a series of buttons on the console surrounding him. "Get those doors open," he snapped at Otto, pointing at the heavy steel slabs that sealed the hangar. Otto didn't hesitate for a second. He just closed his eyes and reached out once again for the Dreadnought's control systems. What could only have been a couple of seconds seemed like hours as he frantically searched through the hangar section's subroutines looking for the door controls. Down in the passenger compartment, Wing pressed a pad against the bullet wounds in Raven's thigh, the gauze already soaked with blood. Raven inhaled sharply, putting her hand on top of Wing's and pressing down more firmly as more rounds hit the shroud's hull outside, and it lifted off. Up on the flight deck, Nero pulled at the joystick and turned the hovering shroud toward the hangar doors. "Otto," Nero said impatiently. "Got it," he yelled, his eyes flying open to see the huge steel doors begin to slide apart. Nero waited for a couple of seconds as the doors ground open, and then pushed hard on the throttle control. Otto grabbed for a handheld on the back of Nero's seat as the shroud shot forward and through the widening gap, with only inches to spare. In the control room aboard the cloaked aircraft high above the Dreadnought, Jason Drake slammed his fist down on the radar console in front of him. He watched the replay of the video feed from the camera mounted on the helmet of one of his men in the hangar. There was no doubt about it. The 2 figures running across the hangar just before they were obscured by a cloud of dense white smoke were Nero and his pet assassin Raven. "Contact the Dreadnought. Have them blow that shroud out of the sky," he yelled angrily. Drake knew that his own aircraft was too large and slow to give chase. "Our men have only just taken the bridge, sir," one of Drake's men replied nervously. "We won't have access to the weapon systems for a few more minutes." Drake cursed quietly to himself. "Retask satellites 9 and 13. Track its flight path and scramble an intercept team to go in as soon as we've worked out where it's going to land," Drake ordered. "There are to be no survivors. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Chapter 4. Nero scanned the shroud's control panel with a worried expression. They were low on fuel. He knew that he was going to have to put the shroud down somewhere very soon. They had no chance of making it back to Hive. Their best chance was if he could touch down somewhere near one of the safe houses that Raven maintained for just such an occasion in various cities around the world. He plotted their flight range against their remaining fuel load and realized that there was only one realistic option, but it would mean flying through one of the most densely populated airspaces on the planet. He punched the destination coordinates into the autopilot and activated it. He knew that the shroud's stealth systems would render it undetectable to civilian or military radar, but he also knew the increased power consumption would mean running out of fuel while they were still over the ocean. Clearly not a desirable outcome. So he had to work on the assumption that wherever they went, Drake would be able to follow them. He got up out of the pilot's seat and climbed down the ladder to the passenger compartment. Raven sat applying a field dressing to her leg in one of the seats that ran along the side of the compartment. "How is it?" Nero asked as he sat down beside her. "The bullet went straight through," she said, pulling the plastic cap from a syringe with her teeth and sticking it into her leg just above the wound. "I've had far worse, as you well know." "Indeed," Nero said with a slight smile. "I'm taking us to one of your safe houses. I assume you have all the medical supplies that you'll need there." "Of course," Raven replied, leaning back against the bulkhead. "Have you contacted anyone else yet to let them know what has happened?" "No, not yet," Nero replied. "I'll contact Hive once we reach the safe house. To be honest, I don't know who else we can trust at the moment." "Hardly an unusual state of affairs in our line of work," Raven replied. On the other side of the compartment, Otto sat watching Nero and Raven's hushed conversation. Nero had said nothing to them about what had happened on the Dreadnought or who was responsible, but he could tell from their expressions that something had gone very wrong. "I guess we can forget the training mission, then," Laura said quietly, sitting down next to Otto. "Looks that way," Otto said, rubbing his temples with a frown. "Something wrong?" Laura asked. "I don't know," Otto said quietly. "What do you mean?" Laura asked, looking worried. "It's probably nothing," Otto said. "It's just that when I took control of that shroud, I felt something weird." "Weird how?" Laura said. "Weird like there was someone helping me," Otto said, staring at the floor. "It's hard to describe, but it's not the first time I've felt it. It's like there's someone with me, giving me their strength." "It's happened before?" Laura asked. "Yeah," Otto replied. "Like I say, it's hard to explain. I'm not sure I like it much. It feels as though I'm sharing my head with someone." "I wouldn't worry about it," Laura said, putting her hand on Otto's knee. "This thing you can do is strange enough as it is. It's hardly surprising that sometimes you find it hard to understand everything that's going on. You're interfacing with machines while in an altered state of consciousness. That's gotta register pretty high on the weird scale. Who knows what tricks that brain of yours could be playing on you?" "I suppose you're right," Otto said with a sigh. "I just hope I'm not losing it." "Even if you are, who's honestly going to notice one more nutcase in this asylum?" Laura said with one grin, gesturing at the others sitting around the compartment. "Well, there is that, I guess," Otto said with a smile. The shroud descended toward the skyline of New York City as the first light of dawn began to spread across the city. Nero glanced at the fuel readouts. He'd had no choice but to engage the shroud's thermoptic camouflage system as they flew into one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. But that meant the tiny amount of fuel remaining was disappearing at an alarming rate. He steered toward the coordinates of Raven's safe house, hoping quietly to himself that he could find somewhere discreet enough to land nearby. He flew low over the warehouse buildings and industrial units that were dotted close to the river. The fact that it was so early in the morning meant there were fewer people and cars on the streets, but there were still enough witnesses around to make an uncloaked landing impossible. This was, after all, the city that never sleeps, Nero thought. The shroud was now more or less on top of the correct coordinates, and Nero spotted what looked like a viable spot to land in the middle of a loading area behind an abandoned warehouse. He dropped the shroud gently onto the asphalt with barely a bump. Only the fairest whisper of engine noise and a rush of wind from the engine's downwash gave away the fact that they were there at all. Nero breathed a sigh of relief and climbed out of the pilot's seat, hurrying down the ladder that led below. "We must move quickly," he instructed, as Raven ushered the students toward the loading ramp that was slowly descending at the rear of the compartment. Nero watched Raven and the others move away from the shroud, and then climbed quickly back up to the flight deck and punched a series of commands into the autopilot. He checked the instructions just once before hurrying back down the ladder to join the others as the loading ramp closed behind him, and with a rush of wind and an almost inaudible whine, the shroud lifted off again. With luck, if the fuel held out, it would crash into the sea offshore in a few minutes' time. They could not afford to leave it uncloaked when the fuel ran out. A military-grade aircraft of unknown design being found in the middle of New York would draw far too much attention, even if its passengers and crew were long gone. "Are you okay to walk?" Nero asked Raven. "Fine, let's go," Raven said, pushing herself away from the wall that she had been leaning against. Nero and the others followed as she made her way to the gate leading out of the landing area, only limping slightly. She gestured for them all to stay put while she checked the pavement on the other side of the gate. There were a couple of people walking down the road, and the odd car trundling past. Raven ducked back inside. "The safe house is not far, about a block east of here," she said quietly, "but we are not the most inconspicuous group."